We left off talking about advantages and disadvantages of recycling, but I want to just go back really quickly to this page to assure that you guys are aware of the mistake I made in class. So when we deal with garbage, the first thing that happens is this. The clay and plastic liner is laid out, then the leachate collectors are laid out, then the garbage is dumped, and then they cover it. Okay, so the order 1, 2, 3, 4 was correct. I'm going to show you the diagram here. I started class talking about dumping day, so I focused on this. So after dumping day, you got the daily cover, then the plastic liner, because even though this diagram only shows one layer, this continues to pile up, okay? So you got this clay barrier, you got this plastic liner, and then you've got these little pockets of garbage, and every day they layer it with soil. So that way they can compact it and make sure that nothing trickles down, okay? But if they have to add an additional plastic layer, they will. So then we talked about advantages and disadvantages, and then we talked about advantages and disadvantages to recycling, and now we're going to talk about advantages and disadvantages to incinerating or burning garbage, okay? So advantage, bottom line, we don't need space for a landfill. That's a huge advantage, and it's going to reduce the amount of garbage in the world, and we need to do that because at this point we are running out of space. We don't know what we're going to do with it. We should probably focus on this, which is take the take this waste and produce energy. This would be the biggest advantage, and the fact that you can do that is a huge thing. So instead of just getting rid of trash, we can now utilize it to power, make gasoline. This is biomass fuel. So if it's sorted, we can do this. Disadvantages, it's going to be competition with recycling companies and really any other form of waste management. People are going to oppose to sites of incinerators or these types of burning to make fuel. As I mentioned in class, a lot of landfills can try to open up this plant to convert their waste to energy to reduce the amount of garbage they're dumping in the landfill. But they have to have that site rezoned, and they get opposition from all the surrounding neighbors who can attend this meeting and then not approve that change of zone. So they end up not being able to build it. We know that anytime you burn something, it's going to produce emissions, and any kind of organic matter can produce carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. The scary thing is that we're talking here all this time about municipal waste, and municipal waste can contain chemicals that we are unaware of what they're going to do when burned, okay? We're not the type of people that sort our garbage to make sure that hazards are removed. And that's what I'm going to talk about next is hazards. And then they could be fairly expensive. So landfills is the cheap. Once you have the land, you get to reuse it and pile it up. But incinerators, have to maintain the plant, and it gets costly. So hazardous waste. Remember, we've been talking about waste from your home, and waste from your home you dump. It either goes to the landfill, it gets recycled, or it gets burned. And none of those instances we sort. Many of you have thrown away batteries, light bulbs, chemicals from cleaning products, and that's things that you don't sort. When we talk about hazardous waste, the industry produces a bulk of them, and industry will have strict rules on how to deal with them, but we do not. So think about our landfills, our incinerators for municipal waste, and the damages they can do while I go through this unit. So here are examples of hazards. A hazard can be a toxic substance. A toxic substance is anything you inhale. So I'm talking about chemical hazards here, okay? Toxic substances, when inhaled or ingested, will cause damage, or even sometimes absorbed through your skin. Some toxic substances are considered reactive, which means they can explode. Some are corrosive, which means they can eat away or break down through a surface, like your skin. And then you've got flammable, which can ignite. So I'm going to go through a slide that kind of covers a couple of these. When we're talking about hazardous waste from the industry, Here's a great example that you're probably very familiar with, which is medical waste. Medical waste has its own storage containers and its own pickup, and it's dealt with in its own way. And I'm going to talk to you in a minute about how we deal with hazardous waste or the different methods. We already learned about nuclear waste, but remember, this is an industry that produces heavy amounts of waste that have to be dealt with. And to review, you've got low-level radioactive waste, which comes from tailings or from any kind of article of clothing or rag used in the plant that has radiation. It gets buried in these steel or concrete drums. So they place them in the drums and then they bury them in the ocean or underground, and as we learned in the last site in the Yucca Mountain. Then you've got intermediate radioactive waste, which comes from the plant parts during decommissioning. Those parts have to be buried because they're also highly radioactive. And then you've got the high-level radioactive waste, which comes from fission. And that waste we know has to be placed in pools for up to 20 years before it's placed in these drums and then before it's buried. So that's nuclear waste. And then something you guys really don't think of, which has really become a huge problem, is electronic waste. So the United States of America, produces half of the world's electronic waste. 70% of our waste actually goes to China, which people always question why. Well, they're going to reuse all these parts probably. And then we only have a limited amount that we actually recycle. But the rest gets reused somewhere else, so that's good. I'm going to start here. So we just talked about e-waste, okay? How many of you have thrown away any kind of electronic in your garbage and it ends up in our regular landfill? Well, these electronics can have lead in them. And lead is something that's been banned in pencils, in gasoline. We used to have leaded gasoline, now we don't. And it's become something that, when entered our water supply, led to cancer and mental retardation. Here are just examples of other problems like mercury that's in your batteries. If you've thrown away batteries and not considered them hazardous waste, they cause damage to major organs. Benzene, which is found in like paints and solvents, can cause mutations. Nickel, found in cell phones, can lead to, again, major organ damage. Any kind of agricultural waste, and if we go back, I'm just going to view browsers, and we go back to most discarded waste in the home, and we're here. We know that grass clippings is part of it, and grass clippings a lot of times will contain pesticides or insecticides or something of that nature, and that is actually considered arsenic, which could also lead to cancer. So I'm going to say this nicely. You don't have to know these, but I wanted you to look at them and become familiar with them, and hopefully if anything pops up on the AP exam, this is something you could recognize. Hazardous waste treatment. So we have the hazards. We've got medical hazards, electronic hazards, and they do get treated. They get treated chemically, which basically will be some form of chemical to break down the chemicals within the hazards. Heated, organically treated, or separated, like filtering and things of that nature. That's what happens to hazardous waste. Before we either we treat it or we recycle it or we dispose of it, but hopefully we do this before we come here or here. When we do store it, it goes in containers, and then they can be placed here in landfills. So when they're placed in landfills, we follow the same type of situation where we actually add the layer of plastic and clay, and then add the sand. Then we put the drums of the hazardous waste inside, and then we add the topsoil, the vegetation. So basically it's the same format as a landfill, except the hazardous waste gets placed in drums inside the landfill. Another thing we do with hazards is injection wells. So injection wells is a way to treat hazardous waste differently from a landfill, because what we're going to do is send through these pipes, we're going to pump the hazardous chemicals down below past aquifers to make sure we avoid any kind of contamination to our water supply. and then get rid of it that way. And these are just different types of wells, which you don't have to know. You just have to know what an injection well does. So these are the first two acts we're actually covering. We're going to have a whole act section coming up, but you want to know that whenever hazardous wastes are dealt with, they are regulated by these two acts. Safe Water Drinking Act, very easy to recognize. It's a law that protects our drinking water. And we know that anytime you dump into a landfill, you have the possibility of leaching, which is water taking chemicals with it through infiltration and percolation that can end up in our groundwater or lead to runoff to a large body of water. So we don't want those chemicals there, so they're constantly monitoring that. And then this act, which is called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It's always one you have to know. And the name does not match at all what the act represents. The act represents managing hazardous waste and non-hazardous solid waste. So it's about dealing with garbage, and it's an act that focuses on proper management of these hazardous, this waste in general. So keep that in mind. You have to be familiar with these two.